This video was made possible with the brand new Corsair Scimitar RGB Elite. With a whopping 17 programmable buttons and the patented key slider control system, you'll finally be able to keybind all of your favorite emotes. Get yours today with code MIZTEC for 10% off at Corsair.com. Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of the visual guide for Eden's Verse Refulgence Savage. This is a continuation of the part 1 guide and begins with the post-ad phase. If you're looking for part 1, be sure to click on the link in the description below. As a reminder, the perfect strategies for this fight are still being optimized and may change over time. My name is MIZTEC and I'll be your raid guide. In this phase, the first and second player on the enmity list will be targeted for spicy auto attacks. The two tanks need to make sure they are number 1 and number 2 at all times. The boss will then cast Akmorn. This will target the number 1 and number 2 enmity players for 3 hits that deal high damage and place either a blue or green debuff on the player's hit. The color of this debuff is determined by which tank is getting hit and really only serves to force the group to split into 2, as players will instantly die if they take damage from the Akmorn of the opposite color. Immediately after, the boss will target the primary tank with Morn Afa. This attack deals massive damage that can be shared by players in proximity. To deal with this, you can either have a tank immunity the attack away from the group, or have everyone stack together and further mitigate the damage with raid cooldowns. Next, the boss will cast Mirror Mirror. This time, 1 green, 1 red, and 1 blue mirror will spawn in the north, east, and west, with the green mirror always in the north. Blue mirrors will reflect any boss attack at the exact same time that she casts it. The boss will then cast Hallowed Wings, and one side of her wings will glow. This will target that entire half of the platform for high damage and a damage down debuff. Since the blue mirror will immediately reflect this attack, only one quadrant will be safe from this first attack. The green mirror will then reflect the attack, and the boss will begin casting another Hallowed Wings. This second cast will coincide with the reflection from the red mirror, making it so only one quadrant is safe again. While this can make your brain hurt, the movement boils down to a simple clockwise or counterclockwise movement from the first safe spot during each attack. If the blue mirror spawns in the west, players will be moving clockwise. If the blue mirror spawns in the east, players will be moving counterclockwise. To determine the safe quadrant, players can first move to the safe side of the boss and then transpose Shiva in place of the blue mirror and imagine the attack intersecting the platform from that position. This can be tricky, as Shiva may also flip her own position in the center before the cast. Once that first safe quadrant is determined, the raid can move one quadrant over each attack to avoid the rest of the attacks. Next up, Worm's Lament will mark up all tanks and healers with red Wormclaw debuffs and all damage dealers with blue Wormfang debuffs. A glowing dragon head will also spawn on the north edge that will begin to rotate around the platform either clockwise or counterclockwise. All of these debuffs have different durations, and each player must cleanse their debuff before they expire or you will die. To cleanse red debuffs, players must touch the dragon head. This will deal damage and leave behind a white puddle on the platform. To cleanse blue debuffs, players must stand inside of these white puddles. While the dragon head is moving around the platform, the boss will be casting Hallowed Wings towards the side it's currently on. Since each debuff is on its own timer, players will need to cleanse their debuffs in a very controlled manner. The red players will have debuffs starting at 13 seconds, 22 seconds, 30 seconds, and 38 seconds, and they'll cleanse in that same order. The blue players will have debuffs starting at 20 seconds, 28 seconds, 36 seconds, and 44 seconds, and they too will cleanse in that order. The timing for all these cleanses is very rigid and revolves around each Hallowed Wing cast. As soon as the dragon head spawns in the north, the first red player will move to it to cleanse their debuff. This will leave the first cleanse puddle directly in the north. The boss will also be casting the first Hallowed Wings during this time, either to the east or the west, depending on the direction the head is traveling. As soon as that first Hallowed Wing cast goes off, the second red player will move in to cleanse their debuff. Depending on the dragon's head direction, this will drop the second cleanse puddle in either the east or the west. At the same time, the first blue player will be moving into the north puddle to cleanse. Both players must return to the boss before the second Hallowed Wing cast goes off. Once the second cast goes off, the third red player will cleanse in the south, and the second blue player will cleanse in the second puddle on the east or the west. At this point, the dragon head will be on the opposite side of the platform, and the next 2 Hallowed Wing casts will be in the opposite direction. Once this cast goes off, the final red player will cleanse at the dragon head, while the third blue player cleanses in the south. The final Hallowed Wing cast goes off, and the final blue player will cleanse in the final puddle. Once all these debuffs are resolved, the boss will emote again and change clothes. The platform will be covered in thin ice, and all players must make sure they do not move. In Savage, thin ice makes you slide almost the entire length of the platform and can can be quite deadly if you lose control, so be careful. The boss will then cast either Twin Stillness or Twin Silence. Thin Ice will disappear halfway through the cast, giving players a very short opportunity to reposition to the appropriate safe side. Stillness will target the 270 degrees in front of her first, immediately followed by the 90-degree attack behind her. As soon as the ice disappears, players will need to be directly behind her and then immediately move in front as soon as the first attack goes off. Silence will target behind her first, before throwing out her frontal attack. As soon as Thin Ice disappears, players will need to quickly position themselves in front and then be ready to move behind her as soon as the first attack goes off. Players will be able to pre-position at the junction between these two attacks as soon as the Worm's Lament mini-phase ends and before the Thin Ice forms, making this dodge a simple feat. Next up, Double Slap will target the primary target for a heavy-hitting tank buster. You'll need to mitigate this appropriately and tank swap. At this point, Shiva will call upon her love and change form again. Anytime she does this, Akral attacks will target the ground underneath players for high damage and debuffs. Since standing in these attacks is almost certain death, players will need to bait these attacks and quickly move away from them to avoid them entirely. To do this, we divide the group in the same Akmorn groups and stand on the north and south sides of the boss. As soon as Shiva spreads her wings, the location of the Akrals is determined, and players are free to move out of the way. We have both groups rotate clockwise out of the way of the attacks. Next, Mirror Mirror will spawn one red mirror and one green mirror in the east and west, in a random pattern. She will then jump to either the north or south edge and cast Hallowed Wings. All players will need to move directly behind her to avoid this attack, while identifying what side the green mirror is on. After this double wing attack goes off, players must run to and line up in front of the green mirror. The reflected attack will deal high damage, knock back all players, and apply a magic vulnerability up debuff on the first 4 players hit. This attack will also deal the most damage to the first player hit. The red mirror will then reflect the same attack in the same manner. To handle this, we again split the group into 2 and line up in front of the green mirror in a controlled manner. The first group to be hit will stand closer, with that group's tank in front with cooldowns. The second group will stand behind these 4 players, with the tank first in line for that group. After the first reflection knockback, the 2 groups will swap positions, with the undebuffed group lining up first with their tank in front, while the debuffed group lines up behind them with their tank in front. The damage here can get pretty spicy, so make sure you use what you can to mitigate some of this damage. Healers be ready with those shields and heals. Next up, the boss will cast Mirror Mirror again. This time, 2 blue mirrors will spawn, either east and west or north and south. 4 green mirrors will spawn in each intercardinal position, and 2 red mirrors will spawn at the cardinals that the blue mirrors are not in. The boss will then glow and change forms again, and all players will have to look away from her to avoid getting stunned. Getting stunned here is basically a death sentence, so don't get greedy. Since the blue mirror will also reflect the stun immediately, the group can pull the boss directly in front of a blue mirror. They can then dodge both gaze attacks by facing the sides away from the blue mirror and the boss. Immediately after, players will need to look away from any of the green mirrors. With this position, this is easily managed by moving directly behind Shiva and looking towards where the blue mirror used to be. At the same time, the boss will cast Holy, which will deal proximity-based damage from the center of the platform. This attack can be faked, and players will need to pay attention to the orbs above her head. If there is only one orb above her, the attack is real and the group needs to move to the edge to avoid excess damage. If there are 4 orbs above her, the attack is fake, and players will instead need to move into the center to avoid excess damage. The damage from Holy coincides with the gaze reflection out of the red mirrors. If the group is dodging Holy on the edge, they can look outwards to avoid the gaze. If the group is dodging Holy in the center, the red mirrors are already directly perpendicular, and they'll be fine as long as they look in the direction of where the blue mirrors used to be. Next up, the boss will cast Embittered Dance or Spiteful Dance. Embittered Dance will first cast the donut attack and then the point blank AoE immediately after. Players will need to stand inside of her hitbox or be at max range first before running out of melee to avoid the second attack. Spiteful Dance will first cast the point blank AoE and is immediately followed by the donut attack. Players will need to first move out to max range before moving into her hitbox or staying super far away. After the dance attacks, we reposition the boss in the center. Shiva will cast Mirror Mirror again and spawn a single red mirror in the north. She will then change forms again, targeting players for Akral attacks during the animation. We have the group split into 2 again, with one on the north side of the boss and the other on the south side. As soon as the wings sprout, all players will move clockwise to avoid standing in the Akral attacks. The Akrals will be reflected by the red mirror, and players can use the cast bar to determine when it's appropriate to move. As soon as the cast finishes, players will again move clockwise, taking care to stay close to each other. Shiva will cast Akmorn during this time, targeting both tanks again. This Akmorn will hit 4 times before the boss casts Morna Fa. To handle this, the 2 groups will stay separated for the 4 Akmorn hits before all all collapsing into stack for the Morn of Fa. Don't forget your cooldowns. Soon after, the boss will jump into the center and begin to cast Icelit Dragon Song. Similar to Light Rampant in the first phase, this phase will have players dealing with debuffs, towers, and mechanics that will increase their light steep debuff stacks. This time, both tanks and 2 damage dealers will be afflicted with the freezing debuff. Healers will have to Asuna freezing off of the damage dealers but leave the debuff on the 2 tanks. 4 single soak towers will spawn around the center, and all tanks and healers will be chained to one another. We assign the tanks to take the north and south towers, while the healers stand in the east and the west. At the same time, all damage dealers will be marked with these circle markers and will soon drop the same Starburst AoE markers from the first phase. These players will move to the outer circle and drop their AoE markers at their assigned intercardinal positions. While this is happening, the boss is casting Draconic Strike, which will knock back all players from the center. Each damage dealer will need to immediately move back close to the boss before this knockback, or they will die. Since dropping off their markers afflict them with heavy, I would highly recommend using gap closers or sprint to get back in time. Right before the knockback occurs, 2 single soak towers will spawn on the far east and west edges of the platform. The tanks will also succumb to their freezing debuff at this time and be frozen into ice blocks during the knockback, rendering them immune to it. The 2 healers will need to position themselves to be knocked to the east and west to satisfy the requirements of the 2 soak towers. The damage dealers will stand in line with the frozen tanks to be knocked north and south. After the knockback, the Starburst AoEs will explode, and each damage dealer will need to kite their 3 AoE circles away from each other as they make their way back to the boss. Using sprint during this time is highly recommended. Immediately after, a 2-person soak tower will spawn directly in the middle, and the boss will cast Banish, marking up a tank with a stack up marker. The 2 tanks will move into the 2-person tower and soak it. At the same time, they'll need to pay attention to the boss's head orbs and determine if the Banish attack is real or not. If it's real, they'll remain stacked together in the middle. If it's fake, they'll need to spread apart after soaking the tower. Immediately after, a 4-person soak tower will form in the center. At this point, 4 players will have 3 stacks of their debuff, and 4 players will only have 2 stacks. Only players with 2 stacks can move in to soak this 4-person tower. At this time, the boss is casting the House of Light, which will target every single player with a conal attack. After soaking the tower in the center, all players will need to move into their assigned cardinal and intercardinal positions to avoid overlapping the conal attacks. This is the final mechanic of Icelit Dragon Song, and each player's light steep debuff will naturally fall off over time. Immediately after, the main tank can pull SHIVA to the north edge of the platform. She will cast another mirror, and a single red mirror will spawn on the northern edge. Thin ice will cover the platform here, and all players must stay put. The red mirror will then begin the cast to reflect thin ice itself, and all players will need to keep an eye on that cast bar. Before thin ice is reflected, SHIVA will again change forms, and all players will need to get ready for another round of Vakral blasts. This coincides perfectly with the thin ice reflection, and as soon as the wings sprout, thin ice will form. Players will need to slide forward to the south edge of the platform to avoid the Vakral blasts. Make sure you're aiming appropriately so you don't launch yourself off of the platform. The ice does persist for a few seconds here, so make sure you don't slide back into the Vakrals or off the platform by accident, or you will die. Soon after, the boss will jump into the center and cast another Worm's Lament. This time, 2 tanks and 2 damage dealers will be afflicted with the red Wormclaw debuffs, and the 2 healers and 2 damage dealers will be afflicted with the blue Wormfang debuffs. 2 dragon heads will also spawn in the north and south and begin to rotate around the platform either clockwise or counterclockwise. The dragon and puddle cleanses will now happen 2 at a time, but luckily the debuff timers are static in this mini phase, simplifying the order of each cleanse. During this time, the boss will cast Akmorn on the 2 tanks. Groups will split in their assigned positions to avoid overlapping damage. This Akmorn will hit 5 times before Morn Afa targets the main tank. The timing here works out that after the 5th Akmorn hit, each tank will need to go cleanse their debuff. For simplicity's sake, we then have the main tank invuln the incoming Morn Afa away from the group, while the other tank provokes during the cast. During this time, the 2 blue healers can cleanse their debuffs in the available puddles. Immediately after, the next Akmorn will target the tanks again, and groups will remain in their assigned spots to share the damage. This Akmorn will hit 6 times. After the 6th hit, the 2 red damage dealers will run out to touch the dragon heads. During this time, the new tank will also invuln the next Morn Afa away from the group. The final blue damage dealers will run to the puddles to cleanse their debuffs. After this, all players will regroup for the 3rd and final Akmorn, which will hit for a total of 7 times. This next Morn Afa can have everyone stacking together to share the damage. As you can imagine, there is a ton of raid-wide damage in this phase, and you'll need to appropriately map out your raid mitigation during this time. Next up, the boss will cast Mirror one last time, marking the beginning of her enrage. This will spawn red mirrors all around the platform. She will then turn to face either north or south and cast Hallowed Wings. Players will need to move behind her to avoid this attack. All the red mirrors will then begin to reflect Hallowed Wings as well. You'll have until this final Hallowed Wings is reflected to destroy her. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you all in 5.3.